Have you ever looked at movements for social change, these passionate, dedicated groups, and wondered why they sometimes seem to just hit a wall? Well, a really fascinating study by Dr. S.A. Hamid Hosseini suggests there's a kind of hidden barrier at play, something that can sabotage a movement from the inside out. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain and see exactly what that is.
So let's just start with this one, central mystery. What if the very movements trying to change the world are, without even realizing it, being shaped by the logic of the system they're trying to tear down? It's a pretty provocative question, and it's really at the heart of the detective story we're diving into today. First up, let's define the scene of the crime, so to speak. We're talking about the pluriverse. Now, instead of a single universe, I want you to imagine a multiverse of different movements, this huge, sprawling ecosystem of groups all working in their own way to build a better world. That's the world we're going to be investigating.
This quote from Mustafa Hayati just nails the core puzzle perfectly. It makes you stop and ask, are these movements, even with the best intentions, kind of trapped in the language of the old world? Are they accidentally using the master's tools to try and dismantle the master's house?
Okay, so this brings us to our prime suspect, something called compartmentality. It's basically the tendency to see the world in these neat little silos. We put environmental issues in one box, economic justice in another, political reform over in a third, and we completely miss how they're all tangled up together. It's like trying to solve a giant puzzle by only ever looking at one piece at a time. And what's absolutely crucial to understand is that this isn't just some mental quirk we all have. The research shows this way of thinking is actually built into the systems we live in, on purpose. It's a divide and conquer strategy that keeps us from seeing the big picture. And it's so pervasive it can even infect the very movements trying to bring about change.
So if this siloed, fragmented thinking is the poison, then what in the world is the antidote?
Well, the antidote is what the research calls the communist tendency. It's not a strict ideology or a set of rules, but it's more like a muscle you can develop. It's the impulse to see the connections between everything, the economy, the environment, our communities, and then to actually act on that deep interconnectedness. You can think of it as systems thinking for social change. And here it is, the core conflict in a nutshell. On one side, you have compartmentality, the silo. It keeps everything separate, fragmented, and ultimately weaker. And on the other side, you've got the communist tendency, the web, where every single strand is connected, making the whole thing incredibly strong. This is the fundamental shift in thinking we're talking about.
But listen, this is way more than just a cool theory. To actually test it, Dr. Hosseini's team went out and surveyed 96 different social change initiatives all across Australia. They were looking for real-world evidence of both compartmentality and its antidote. And to do this, they had to create a brand new tool, the Commonist Tendency Index, or the CTI. The best way to think about it is like a holistic thinking scanner. It uses this 16-point scale to measure just how well an organization connects its work across all these different areas of life. Okay, so here's a peek under the hood at how the CTI actually works. It's basically a grid. It measures 4 key areas of change, like democratization and equalization, across 4 different spheres of life. So, for example, it doesn't just ask about democracy in politics, it asks about democracy in the workplace, and in our communities, and even in how we relate to the environment. It's specifically designed to spot that connected, web-like thinking.
So, what did the data actually reveal? Well, the average score on the CTI was 3.65 out of 5. Now, that's a really promising sign. It shows that this communist tendency is definitely out there, but it also tells us there's a lot of room for improvement. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. The scores weren't just spread out evenly. Instead, they actually clustered into 2 totally distinct groups. What that means is there's a pretty clear divide in the pluriverse between movements that have a strong, integrated worldview and those that are still kind of stuck in those silos. And this chart, wow, this reveals a massive blind spot. While these movements are often really strong on economic and community issues, they tend to neglect the political dimension. I mean, it's the lowest priority. This is compartmentality in action, and it could seriously be holding them back from making real, lasting change.
So this leads us to the million-dollar question, right? What separates the web thinkers from the silo thinkers? What are the key ingredients for actually fostering this holistic, super connected approach? Well, the data gives us some incredibly clear clues. The groups that scored highest on that CTI index, they had 2 major things in common. First, they were focused on changing the whole system, not just tackling single issues. And second, they were actively building new alternatives, not just fighting against the old system. These really seem to be the secret ingredients.
And check this out, this is where it gets really compelling. Groups that specifically identified as commons-oriented scored way higher on the CTI, a 4.06 versus a 3.56. This just goes to show that having a clear, holistic ideology is an incredibly powerful driver for this kind of integrated thinking.
And it wasn't just about commoning a whole family of related ideas. Things like food sovereignty, ecological democracy, and degrowth all showed a really strong link to this holistic approach. You can start to see a clear pattern emerging here, right?
Now, this is where the research becomes so practical. The team used all this data to create what you might call a solidarity map. But here's the crucial part. It doesn't show who is already working together, it shows who could be working together. It's an amazing tool for movement building because it shows us exactly where the strongest potential alliances are hiding.
And honestly, this might be one of the single most powerful findings of the whole study. It turns out that initiatives that put decolonization at the center of their work were far, far more likely to have a comprehensive, integrated approach. This suggests that a decolonial framework might just be one of the most effective ways to break out of the silos for good.
So, after all that, what's the final verdict? Well, the bad news is that compartmentality is a very real and damaging force. But the good news is that its antidote, this communist impulse, is also real, and we can actually measure it. We know what fuels it, focusing on systemic change and building new alternatives. And most importantly, all of this gives us a real roadmap for building stronger, more connected, and way more effective movements.
So this research really leaves us with a challenge. For anyone and everyone involved in social change, the question is this: how do we consciously stop building walls between our movements and start deliberately building bridges? How do we finally move from silos to synergy?
This whole explainer was based on the absolutely vital research of Dr. S.A. Hamed Hosseini. If you want to go deeper, you can find the full paper in the journal Globalizations. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into what really makes transformation possible.